in the UK. The old traditional elitist universities, probably in the 1960s, even when I went to university, and I actually went to the University of Scotland briefly, about 4%, 4% of the relevant cohort of population, that's 18, 19-year-old school leavers, went to those universities. The massive expansion of red brick universities and technical colleges, and the creation of a whole host of new universities out of previous technical colleges or polytechnics, as many of them were, was also a way in which expanded educational opportunities on an absolutely massive scale. The principal beneficiaries being the kids who went to grammar school or technical school, and a small percentage only, I'm afraid, of those who went to secondary moderns. But now this is just a diversion. As recently as 4 or 5 years ago, the Labour government no longer in power had an aspiration of 50%, 5-0, to go to university, and was well on course to meeting that target. I think the school system and the expansion of higher education were the principal features of the changing nature of social mobility, but there are other things that happened at the same time as well, and it's worth mentioning and making reference to cultural changes in the UK. We were, I would characterise it as the ruling elite were rather stuffy, old school tie, rather buttoned up, tending to send their boys on to military training courses in private school, the officer training regime, and something was happening in the 1960s that began to undermine all of that, and began to give the possibility that people who came from not Southern England, private education, spoke with what was known as BBC received pronunciation, but there's a wide variety of regional accents in the UK. I come from Lancashire, which is one little bit off North West England, and there's at least half of it very discernible and different accents, even in Lancashire, from Liverpool to Manchester to Oldham to Blackburn, my hometown. And if you multiply that, looking across the whole of the country, it is amazing, from Scotland to London to Cornwall to Wales to Northern Ireland, the range of different regional and local accents that have always existed, but were never got expression in the media. Only a certain sort of perceived BBC voice was heard. That all changed massively, and it's not just due to the Beatles. The Beatles were an example of what was happening with the growth of youth culture, pop music, boys growing their hair long, Carnaby Street and outrageous clothes, the drug culture. All of those things that were happening in the 1960s were opening up and breaking down the kind of social taboos and barriers that had also been inhibitions to social mobility. In fact, the class of '68 thought that we had inherited the world, that the old constraints on any of us doing as well as we wanted in whatever walk of life we wanted to do, whether that was the arts or politics or media or academia, law, medicine, whatever. There were no longer existing class boundaries that would restrict the ability of bright kids to do well. All of that was a very optimistic atmosphere, and that's the culture in which I grew up. The evidence now is that, although it wasn't obvious at the time, but about 1980, after, let us say, a golden age of social mobility lasting 30 years, opportunities began to close down and have been continuing to close down ever since. There are a number of factors perhaps at play here. It's not insignificant that in 1979 and then from 1980 onwards there was a Conservative government in power under Mrs. Thatcher, a very powerful and charismatic leader who made one of her mantras to set back the ratchet of socialism. That's how she described what she thought was wrong with the country, that there was too much socialism, and she set about, in a variety of ways, trying to undo the social advances of the previous 30 years. There were attacks on the trade union movement. There was a massive, not quite straight ahead, but an absolutely massive and fundamental 18-month-long miners' strike, which I think both sides on that class divide, even if you didn't want to be in that position, realised that this was a very fundamental struggle. The Conservative government felt it had to be the organised working class, and the miners often saw themselves as in the front rank of the trade union movement and the organised working class, and the government won. That was a setback in many ways for collective bargaining and for the strength of trade unions, from which they have quite possibly not recovered. It's an interesting sociological phenomenon that in the 1960s, when people were asked who's doing well and who's doing badly, people tended to comment more than anything else on their neighbours. There's a very famous sociological text called Relative Deprivation and Social Justice by an eminent sociologist at the time, Professor Runciman, whose analysis revealed that who people thought were doing badly or doing well were basically their neighbours in the street. There were people who had just slightly got a better job with a bit more income and maybe a few extra days holiday a year, whom people were jealous of, perhaps, if they were jealous. And who were worse than them were the people down the street who had some setback and had possibly temporarily out of work. It's an almost ludicrous notion now that people would think that that's the range of the questions of social justice apply to, when it is so very obvious in our society that there is a growing population at the bottom of society, sometimes called the underclass, and there is also growing immensely rich financial elite at the top of society. I think if Runciman read his studies and asked the ordinary member of the public who's doing well and who's doing badly, they would not be talking about the person next door or one in their street. They would actually have a bigger perception of wider future forces that were at play. That's really my introduction to this topic. It is the case that almost all of my friends from those school days in Blackburn and people that I met later at university came from quite ordinary backgrounds, and very many of them rose, if not to the absolute top, they rose pretty high in their profession. All my friends who were teachers wound up as being head teachers at their schools. I have friends who I met at university who came from perfectly ordinary backgrounds, who've risen very high in the legal profession and married to one of Britain's top lawyers. But she didn't come from an any more privileged background than me. She got there by being talented, working hard, and having the opportunity to do that. It's also the case that I have friends who are doctors and university professors. When I was a kid, we didn't know anybody who had even been to university, never mind were professors, things like that. So it has been a golden era for a certain tranche of people born immediately post-war. The evidence is that since the 1980s, since the Big Bang in the city, the deregulation of financial markets, the growth of massive wealth, the globalization of the economy, and other big factors, all of these opportunities are closing down. And it's now a very big topic of conversation in the press in the UK about the role of private schools, because they did not wither away, as we all thought they would in the 1950s and 60s. 7% only of young people in Britain are privately educated, but they have an increasing command over the wealth and opportunities in society. There are all sorts of things that are being talked about what can be done to rectify this state of affairs. Many of them are rather technocratic. Maybe if the audience is interested, some of these things can come out in discussion. But that is my introductory talk about as it were, the social history of social mobility. A 30-year golden era and a 30-year period where it has been frankly stagnation.
So I'm going to ask some quick questions and hopefully we'll have some quick answers and we'll get this discussion moving. Lord Hayward, you talked about the Beatles. There's a famous Who song in roughly the same era called The Kids Are All Right.
My generation, I put it in my notes, but I didn't bother mentioning it.
Well, there's My Generation, the Who song. This was sort of a call to arms to the older generation to say, look, the children of this generation might look a little bit different, but it's okay, we want to change the world. In America, at least, there's been a movement at some of the elite universities, at Harvard and Yale, to say, look, there's a disproportionate number of students from these universities that want to go into wealth management or investment banking or to hedge funds. So are the kids still all right today? Do they want the right things? Or is even this goal to rise up a level of society only fundamentally entrench that which already exists?
Fundamentally, it's the $64,000 question. It would have been unthinkable in the 1960s for kids from my generation, the Who generation, the supporters of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jefferson Airplane, the anti-war protesters, to think about going into wealth management. We were, maybe we were naive, but many of us had great hopes of transforming and improving society, not just making money for ourselves, but to ameliorate the causes of poverty and to generally enhance that sense of things we're always going to get better. Now, that spirit seems to have gone, at least at one level in our society. There have been, I know the children of friends of my generation who are simultaneously proud of the fact that their kids are doing well and making money, and slightly horrified about how they're making their money, and regret the kind of idealism that existed perhaps in the 1960s in Paris and other times, wanting to change the world and improve it. A degree of selfishness appears to have set in. And then when you look at the attitudes of those who are not succeeding and doing well, those at the bottom, either one can notice that there have been riots in London, one can notice that there have been protests at camps in London outside St Paul's Cathedral and replicated in other parts of the world, these can be seen as manifestations of a social dislocation that probably we didn't experience before. Only time will tell whether something can grow out of those movements. I have seen the St Paul's protest movement characterised as young people who are angry about how has we got to where we've got, but who are also completely bewildered about how we've got to where we've got. There is not the spirit that there was emanating French students on the streets of Paris in 1968 at all.
Well,